The first story pack for Borderlands 4, Mad Ellie and the Vault of the Damned, has released somewhat recently. Two not really great reviews, many of which upset with the price tag, the length of the story, and much, much more. But are these criticisms fair? Is Mad Ellie and the Vault of the Damned worth $40 fucking dollars? I don't know, but it's my turn to yap about it. This video is definitely going to have spoilers in it, but for the actual story spoilers themselves, I'm going to try to keep them contained to the actual story section itself. If you want to skip ahead, I'll have everything timestamped so that you can just jump straight to the conclusion of the story section. But story is where we'll be starting off here. Mad Ellie and the Vault of the Damned takes place in the section of Kairos most affected by the crashing of Elpis, where a large monolith has shown up and started mind-controlling people. Namely, it has gotten into Ellie's brain and is making her hear voices of her dead dad. Moxie shows up to play the role of an overprotective parent, with there being two other characters, Robbie, a young boy, and Captain Willis, his dad, who play into this whole monolith corruption thing. Quite literally, this is just almost one-for-one the Guns, Love, and Tentacles storyline, using a very corrupted version of a relationship to contrast the relationship of the two main characters that we're following. The biggest difference is that while in Guns, Love, and Tentacles, we get to really spend a lot of time with our two grooms and hear their concerns about what's happening with their relationship and their fears for the future, we really don't get a lot of time of seeing Ellie and Moxie's relationship and their dynamic outside of Moxie acting really out of character, because they're trying to make her act like a very overprotective mother, a smother, which is really something we've never seen out of Moxie in any of the other games prior, and there's not even really much of an explanation of it within this DLC. It kind of just starts happening, and it's really jarring, especially because it's not even really done well. Her motivations are really confusing, and it really just amounts to her being incredibly suspicious and cagey as fuck towards Ellie for no real reason. Ellie just wants to know about her dad because she's hearing what she thinks is the voice of her dead dad in her brain. Moxie doesn't want to tell her anything about her dad, and at one point literally says, "There's nothing to tell, why won't you believe that?" And like, why would Ellie believe this? If you're saying these words but not telling her anything else, that's really suspicious, to the point where I, myself, as the viewer, have to assume that, yeah, there has to be some reason that she's not telling her about her dad. The problem is, by the end of the DLC, you realize that Moxie's 100% telling the truth here. There is really not much to say about her father. He was a dude that Moxie fell in love with and was killed by the Hodunks. If Moxie would have just told Ellie that from the start, this wouldn't be nearly as frustrating. Like, I get maybe then the concern is, oh, well, we have no narrative. But one, if your narrative is that fragile, then maybe there's a problem here. And two, Ellie's already going cuckoo crazy. She's got fucking voices in her head. You can easily just have her not believe Moxie. Have that be what puts the strain on the relationship, not Moxie being a weird, overbearing mother and Ellie being annoyed that she's not being let outside of the lodge. But the strain comes from the distrust that is being forced into Ellie by this outside force that we're supposed to care about. I mean, they even kind of do this way too late into the DLC, where Moxie says to Ellie, "I'll tell you whatever you want." Why doesn't this happen towards the start? It's showing that Ellie distrusts her because she's going a little cuckoo, but this literally happens within the last, 20 minutes of the game. As it stands, the relationship between these two contrasting relationships with Willis and Robbie and Moxie and Ellie, there's not really much connection to it other than Ellie has a rock around her neck, and that rock is putting voices in her head. And don't get me wrong, I understand what they're going for here. The creature dad thing feels that Robbie was abandoned by his father and distrusts his father. Therefore, they want this distrust between Ellie and Moxie, but it's just weak. In Guns, Love, and Tentacles, there was an active threat, and Wainwright was literally actively being pulled into this other relationship. There was actual real stakes with a character that was well developed and felt like it was actually connected to this other eldritchly twisted relationship. In Mad Ellie, it's just spooky Stranger Things meet dad doesn't like parental figures, especially considering Ellie just at no point really even goes that crazy or mad. Again, it just never really feels like an active threat. I mean, you literally trick her into the speakeasy with the most bullshit lie, and then later on towards the the end of the DLC, while she's outside of the speakeasy, the thing that is apparently protecting her from going crazy, she says, "I'm starting to think this ain't my daddy. He's screaming hellfire in my skull." Which kind of just goes to show that, again, even while she's outside of the speakeasy, this doesn't have that heavy of a control over her. Why does this even happen? Why does she say this? What the fuck? And then, right at the end, Moxie says, "If I'd been honest with you, this wouldn't have happened." Yeah, no shit. No fucking shit. You should have been... Moxie just feels incredibly out of character and exceedingly stupid for being who has been shown to be probably one of the single smartest characters in the entire franchise over the course of every game she's been in. That is kind of like my main gripes with the main plot, but I've got a few smaller ones here, so I'll quickly go through those. One, it feels really weird that Mancubus is even here. He's kind of just here for the lodge or the speakeasy to be the safe haven of the DLC. He's kind of very underused through a majority of the main story, except he's important because of this one mention where there needs to be a blood sacrifice for the stone to be placed back on the monolith. And this is the catalyst for the entire, oh no, my mom's gonna kill herself and sacrifice herself for my betterment from Ellie during the final section of this DLC. And we're trying to chase after Moxie to prevent her from sacrificing herself. She never sacrifices herself. The end comes, Mancubus is kind of just like, haha, I just be saying shit. Enough blood was probably spilt because of that boss that you killed, so it's chill. So once again, no stakes, no real purpose for Mancubus to even be here. I absolutely adore Mancubus. He was what got me super hyped about this DLC in the first place, but again, he's just so underused. Though speaking of characters that did not need to be here, Pickle. Pickle was a huge one that they hyped up for being in this DLC. He dies literally within the first 10 minutes and he does nothing in that time. He shows up to take you over to where you're supposed to go, point you in a direction, and then he literally just dies. Sick, cool, awesome. This could have been literally anyone other than my goat Pickle. They didn't even get his accent right. And the final thing to mention is just, goddamn, this shit isn't scary. This was probably the single biggest draw for me towards this DLC, was they hyped it up as being more of a horror experience than we're used to within this franchise. And the thing is, we've seen how they blend horror with Borderlands previously. Namely, my favorite example of it is the Benediction of Pain from the Krieg DLC in BL3. That entire section proved to me that they can incorporate horror elements into this franchise and do it super successfully, and ever since that part of that DLC, I've wanted them to do a true horror-focused DLC. What we got with Mad Ellie was not that at all. It was kind of the same sort of vibe as Guns, Love, and Tentacles, where it's spooky aesthetics, but it's not really horror, because they kind of try to contain all of the horror within these flashback vision sequences. And it's how they tell the story of Captain Willis and Robbie. You'll just randomly be teleported into a completely different area, you don't have access to any of your guns, and you're effectively walking through a cutscene. It's really jarring. Most of the time, I kind of just felt like it took me out of whatever the hell moment I was currently in. And this isn't that same blend of horror that you got with the Benediction of Pain. The reason Benediction of Pain was so successful was because of how fluid it went from spooky to gameplay, as in, there wasn't even like a transition here or anything. It was just you were playing through this map. Sometimes you were in a little spooky environment, and then you'd be fighting shit. I was talking about this in my Discord server the other day, and I think Guest 1511 put it the best, so shout out there. But they said the reason the Benediction of Pain worked was because it made you feel defenseless while still being powerful. You could shoot at shit that didn't react. Meanwhile, in Mad Ellie, the lack of having your guns out meant you were never in any real danger during the flashback segments. And yeah, I think this hits the nail on the head. Mad Ellie was not a blending of horror and Borderlands like Benediction of Pain was. Mad Ellie was just Borderlands with some spooky cutscenes. To end off the story segment on a lighter note, I really like Daphne. I think Daphne was cool. And ironically, it was pretty damn cool to see plant people hybrids again in this universe. To wrap up the story segment though, I'm not a story guy. As in, I appreciate the good stories that happen within this universe, and I appreciate the lore that has been built up within it through all these years. But it's Borderlands, and I know that the story writing is usually pretty damn subpar, and I don't care care about it. That being said, even coming from someone who has absolutely no shits to give about story and story quality, this one was kind of distractingly bad. It really is just a rehashing of Guns, Love, and Tentacles, but done so unbelievably worse, completely leaving out pretty much anything that made that DLC good and made the relationships that were kind of the focus of that DLC interesting, and instead just boiled it down to the most bare bones telling of this sort of thing possible. And again, even though I'm usually someone who really doesn't care that much about the quality of a story, it's kind of hard to ignore this one for my overall rating, especially because of the duration of this story. Including cutscenes, engaging in some non-required mobbing, and a bit of bumbling around and getting lost here and there, my total time to beat the main story of Mad Ellie and the Vault of the Damned was, holy fucking shit, the credits rolled at 1 hour, 44 minutes, and 27 seconds. I'm pretty sure you can straight shot this all the way through, still including cutscenes, in under an hour and a half. Excluding cutscenes, you can probably do it in like an hour 20, if not shorter. And I know that like blitzing through a DLC, yeah, of course it's going to be kind of short. This is the case with any of the past games, but I can tell you from experience, blitzing through the BL3 DLC, it's usually still around 3 to 4 hours on average. My first playthrough of Mad Ellie's, which I did on stream and was heavily distracted during, was 3 hours total. And this DLC is twice as expensive as the ones from BL3. So this isn't just a kind of mid at best storyline, it's also short as hell. Now, while obviously I'm definitely not too happy with the main story of Mad Ellie's, I will say that there is a decent bit of side quests to experience, and a lot of them are actually incredibly good. Some of them are a little bit heavy on the driving, but for the most part, the writing in these is significantly better than the main story, and overall I just found them more enjoyable. But I think that's about all I have to say about the story part of things, so let's move into the gameplay. I think the biggest issue is kind of just an issue that exists within open world in general, but it's present here, so I think it's worth mentioning. There's just a lot of driving. Most missions kind of are just like you drive for 5 minutes, you mob for 2 minutes, and then you get where you gotta go. There's also very little mobbing that's actually required to do, so you can kind of just skip by most of it considering how many different shortcuts you can take and the ability you have to just drive straight through encounters. Those classic style of linear instanced areas slows down your game time, and it provides more mobbing opportunities when you can't just drive through everything, which I do think having more of those kinds of sections would have really helped this DLC, especially if they're really wanting to stick with that spookier vibe. I think the best part of the gameplay of this DLC is towards the end where you're in the ship. It's very close quarters combat, which is again not only great for creating that spooky vibe, being very claustrophobic and having a lot of opportunity for you to just round corners and be immediately face first with a horde of enemies, but it was also just a very long section of straight mobbing. It was a very cool section, it was incredibly fun, and I just wish that there was way more of this style of mobbing within this DLC. But even with that though, I still kind of wish they took it further, because there's some sections where you were in a vent crawling through them, and it would have been awesome if there were some of the like torso enemies that have been introduced in this DLC just kind of crawling around in there. Now, as much as I was kind of harping on the fact that there is a lot of driving in this DLC, I do have to say I definitely enjoyed my time driving in this DLC than I did at any point during the main game of BL4. And that's because almost immediately I noticed that the environments and the level design were so much better, and likely this is because they have more experience working within the open world format, but also this is a smaller open world zone than the base game. There's a lot more variance, not only just between each of the major zones themselves, but even within the zones, environments looked incredibly different from one section to another. They were a lot more interesting to look at, everything looked a lot more intentional with its placement, and overall it did feel a little bit more like the classic style of environment design that we're more used to within this franchise. Definitely not quite, and I do of course still prefer the instant zones personally, but I did still want to point out that these environments are a hell of a lot better and I did really enjoy them. BL4 has had a big issue with enemy variety, in that there's very little of it and a lot of combat encounters aren't very interesting or engaging with the enemies that are present. This DLC, on the other hand, did absolutely amazing with introducing new and interesting enemy types and making encounters feel really fun and interesting to engage with. There's enemies that split into smaller enemies as you kill them. There's the big-ass mechs and their various variants. Given that these are enemy types that came from Elpis, there's also a lot that engage you from the air. Again, overall, it's just a really fun time mobbing through this DLC, and I hope that this is a sign of good things to come. But it's not only mobbing, because bossing is also incredibly well done here. Pretty much every single boss I think is really cool and really interesting, having really fun designs and really cool mechanics, with the only problem being that they are all way too squishy, including the final boss itself. As in, I'm pretty sure that there's badasses, like I think the badasses in this game that had the triple health bars have more health than these bosses did. During my first playthrough, I was literally playing worse and actively nerfing myself to the best of my ability so that I could actually see all of the mechanics and all of the attacks that these enemies had. And even then, there was boss attacks that I only ever saw later on because I was still killing them way too fast. And I know that, you know, I came into this DLC playing on a fully kitted out character, but I'm pretty damn sure most of the bosses in the base game are tankier than they are in this DLC. And again, the reason that that really sucks is because of how cool and well designed pretty much all of these bosses are. Most people probably aren't going to see all of these attacks or engage with these bosses in the way that they're intended to. But I can tell you that people will definitely be engaging with these bosses often, at least for their gear, because holy shit, it feels like Gearbox actually listened to the complaints that people had about how boring a lot of the legendaries in BO4 were and have been. We have genuinely interesting weapons with really cool and unique mechanics that are all pretty damn good. I'm not going to go into each and every one of them, but a couple standouts to me are the Shoot and Scoot, which is a Torgue pistol that summons ghost guns, probably one of the best sticky applicators in the game now. The Laser Cutter being a Vladoff AR and a reference to Dead Space and just feeling really good to use. Fear Stalker being a very interesting Jacobs that stacks crit damage on body shot and body shot damage on crit, and probably my single favorite, the Cyclone, sort of being a mix between the Bloodstarved Beast and the Free Radical from Borderlands 3. And that's only a few because pretty much all of these weapons are really cool and really fun to use. There's a few stinkers in there, but for the most part, this is definitely moving in the right direction. But it's not just legendaries, because we did get 3 new pearls with this DLC, and while I won't spoil what all of them are, I will say 2 out of the 3 of them are really fucking cool. But if you've seen my previous video talking about pearls and how I found them a little bit disappointing with their implementation, the implementation in this DLC is only more disappointing. They are straight up just dedicated drops here. They aren't tied to any specific activity, you just get them the same way you get any other dedicated drop, as well as they still just have the elemental override. In my pearl video, I theorized that maybe depending on the type of content that you get your pearl from, this might change the actual effect and what it is. But no, it does just seem like every pearl moving forward is going to have an elemental override, and that's the effect that we get. But speaking of activity, let's talk about Nightmare Rifts. This was something that was mentioned prior to the DLC releasing. They talked about how the DLC is coming with a new endgame activity, but they immediately mentioned that they were kind of just Rifts 2.0, and that is precisely what they are. You drive around the map, you look for a big red beam in the sky, and you go and touch it. It drops you into a rift, you kill the shit out of some enemies, and then they drop you a bunch of legendaries, with some legendaries having this as the only way that you can actually get them. This is a very obnoxious farming method. It's a very boring farming method, and it's a very uninteresting farming method. Considering this game desperately needs more actual endgame content, it is really a shame that the endgame activity content that they decided to add with this DLC is 1, nothing new, and 2, nothing fun. And the last thing I think is worth mentioning in this section is just the fact that the music here was definitely a little bit better. I do think most of it was still just like ambience tracks and not nearly as interesting as the ambience tracks in other games, but it is a hell of a lot better than the ambience that is present in the base game, and any of the actual songs I also thought was a lot better than the base game. Still disappointing for a franchise with a history of really solid music tracks, but again, at least things are getting better. But that's only for the story part of Story Pack 1, because we still have to talk about cash. And no, I'm not talking about the $40 that we spent on this DLC, I'm talking about the new Vault Hunter. And man oh man, is this definitely a paid character, because holy fuck, Cash is possibly one of the most overtuned characters we've ever seen in this franchise, and this is a franchise that has Salvador. The actual design of Cash is really cool. I like the concept of this character. I think he looks fantastic. But man, it really just feels like this character was made so that you could play the game without playing the game. I mean, Crossfire is literally an action skill that you don't even need weapons for. You can just equip that and go. That's how I leveled my Cash without having to farm anything. I started a level 30 Cash and I immediately went Crossfire to start doing vile bounties. And I was met with absolutely no resistance in doing that. Bone totems are a little bit similar. They're a little bit more of an active play style. There's some builds that you can do with them where they're just kind of more supportive. If you go full green tree though, generally bone totems are going to kind of be playing the game for you as well. And the only action skill I find that you really have to think while using is the cards, which I do think the cards is really cool. His skill trees though, on the other hand, again, overloaded as hell. You can really just throw points anywhere and it doesn't matter. He has so many skills that on any other Vault Hunter would be multiple different skills in one. I think my current favorite example of this is probably from Gloam to Glow, where a portion of all damage Cash is dealt from enemies is converted into Overshield, which again, that there, you could stop there and that's probably still a really solid skill. But on top of that, he also has whenever Cash loses a fortune stack, shots from his guns deal bonus damage equal to his Overshield. This is a really solid defensive skill and utility skill that also is probably one of his single best damaging skills because that's a flat addition to all of his weapons. He also has so many skills that just convert some stat into a damage stat. Some of these are damage stats converting into damage stats, like fire rate being converted into damage. So this Vault Hunter literally gets more damage per damage. It's a little bit ridiculous and also technically a double dip, but intentional, so I guess that's fine. He's also got some infinitely stacking damage, which is fun. He has some shit that can get him up to like 4,000 gun damage and 2,000 skill damage, and he's an interesting one. And I think that's kind of where my opinion on him lands. I think Cash is very interesting. I think he's one of the most unique Vault Hunters in BL4, but I don't really think it's for a good reason. It really just seems like they slapped a bunch of shit into him and called it a day. And I don't know, I see the appeal, but he's not really for me. But the big question, the big question without me dropping water on my pants this time, is this DLC worth $40? Half the price of the base game, almost. No, absolutely not. I mean, this is less content than we've gotten from past DLCs, and this literally comes with a whole-ass Vault Hunter. Genuinely, I think pricing this the same as past DLCs at around $20 is the most fair that it could be. But excluding the price from the equation, what do I actually think about this DLC overall? The main story is really shit at worst and pretty mid at best. It's just a rehashing of something done significantly better in Guns, Love, and Tentacles. Environments are a lot better here. I enjoyed my time on the map a lot more than I did the base game. Side quests were also incredibly enjoyable and is where it seems like most of the better writing is. Enemies are really fun, bosses are incredibly cool if a little bit squishy, and weapon drops are amazing. Pretty much all of the weapons here are incredibly fun and really cool to use. Combat encounters though were a little bit sparse. Overall gameplay I think was just a little bit sparse. There's way too many things that you can just completely ignore and drive straight through, but I mean, of course, you can just opt into doing it anyways and get more gameplay out of it. But even then, the overall duration of the main story, at least, is under 2 hours. And then, of course, there's the Nightmare Rifts, which take one of the lamest pieces of endgame content, if you can even call it that, and makes it even more annoying and lame. And then, of course, we got our new Vault Hunter, Cash, who is incredibly busted, overloaded, and cool, but I'm not a huge fan of him personally. But overall, I did enjoy my time with this DLC, despite it taking 98 hours for me to actually gain access to the content that I paid for. Hey, if you weren't aware of that, check out this video in the top corner, highly recommend it. And I would give it overall a solid 6 out of 10. I think it feels pretty fair to put it above average. I mean, it could definitely be worse. I don't think overall as a package it is actively bad. As I said, there is actually a lot of good that I think this DLC did, but it's not that much more above average. Definitely wait for a sale if you want to buy this. That's gonna about do it for this one though. I hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, definitely consider leaving a like, comment, subscribe, all that. Down in the description will be a link to my Twitch channel where you can follow to be notified of when I go live, and just below that is a link to my Discord server where you can come and join and hang out. But with that all being said, I hope to see you guys in the next one.